Welcome everyone to Chapter 3, Understanding Leadership Styles. In this lecture, we will be looking at some classic leadership philosophies, leadership styles, and styles of followers. We're looking at theories X, Y, and Z. Hopefully you probably recall those from another class. They're pretty famous. Not going to do any review that you would have gotten somewhere else, hopefully. And besides knowing the three theories, you'll want to see how those philosophies impact communication. Next, you'll want to know the three leadership styles and the positives and negatives of each one. Finally, we're going to cover follower styles. A lot of that information is not in the book, so you'll want to take good notes on the testable material, for example, jotting down what you'll see on the slide. So why does this matter? It's important to know your style and your philosophy because it impacts your communication with others. In turn, your communication will play a role in how you respond to others, how they respond to you in all of their work. This affects your effectiveness as a leader. Understanding your viewpoint of how people work and how they should be led can help you identify your approach's strengths and potential weaknesses as a leader. Additionally, if you understand leadership styles as a follower, you can anticipate the expectations and behaviors of your leader, and that can make you more effective in your communication. Your leadership communication is rooted in your leadership philosophy, meaning your beliefs about human nature and the nature of work. And I know I said earlier this is going to get complicated. This is the start of where it gets really complicated. Douglas McGregor, so this is the scholar you might remember from another class who proposed theory X and Y, explained that leaders' assumptions of how followers viewed work and were motivated impact how a person led their followers. Our textbook covers theories X and Y quite well. And in fact, we've mentioned this idea that understanding how people view work and how people view leadership can help you communicate. This goes into more depth here. Really quick, brief review in case this is fuzzy from the past. A leader who has theory X philosophy assumes that the average person dislikes work and will avoid it if given a chance. Because of that, people need to be directed and controlled. Without external direction or controls, people won't work. People want security, not responsibility. Workers want their leaders to take care of them and protect them. They want their leaders to set the goals. Again, that's not what I'm saying. This is what the theory says. If a leader has this philosophy toward their followers, they see it as their role to motivate followers and take on a lot of responsibility because they believe, A, things won't get done without the leader motivating and monitoring their followers, and B, people want direction and need leadership. In this theory, that means the leader plays a large role in getting others to do their work. That means the leader takes on a lot of responsibility for their followers' actions. They emphasize tasks, remember from the earlier chapters, but task supervision. And a workplace with an assembly line might be a good example of where this is effective. It's a repetitive job. There's a need for quality, consistency, and control. It could get a little boring for some people. So some people might be more invested than others in it. Some people might really enjoy the consistency and continuous nature of it, and others might not be so. So the leader would need to incentivize them to focus on the task. I've also seen this in academic institutions where if you have try not to name names here, but there's some places where they assume students are not going to do their job or not going to do their work or not learn unless they're heavily penalized. So if you know of an academic program where they're just known for giving super low grades, and not UT but another school, that's kind of where they're going. Like they think they give these low grades and they have to monitor, they have to motivate the followers with punishment because students need direction and they won't learn without it. Probably getting from my tone, that's not quite what I think there. All right, with theory Y, they assume people like work, they see it as satisfying and enjoy accomplishing things. They believe people are self-motivated. Leaders don't have to motivate them because they're committed to work objectives. People accept and seek responsibility, and if they have the opportunity, people will be productive and they'll take on responsibilities. With this philosophy, a theory Y leader doesn't serve as a taskmaster as much. The followers take on the responsibility willingly and are self-directed. So in theory Y, the focus is on the individual and their commitment level. The tasks are not ignored, but viewed in the terms of the people involved, and that's from Johnson and Hackman's work. Where in theory X, the focus is really heavily on the task. Now, theory X, theory Y, not polar opposites. It sounds a little like they are. So you either see people as lazy or motivated. You have to watch them like crazy or you trust them completely. That's a really common criticism of these theories. McGregor, again, the creator of the theories, emphasized that people should view them not as opposites, but as options a leader can choose depending on the situation and people involved. This is important. It recognizes the role of situation and followers in leadership communication. So these options are on a spectrum, and a leader should be prepared to adjust their approach if needed. This is called the contingent theory of leadership. You even take a second and think about how you operate as a follower, or let's go back to that school example, how you operate as a student. I'm going to guess there's classes you've had where you're so interested and into the topic, you need no external motivation for that. You're self-motivated, you like the work, you're working ahead, you're going beyond the class. And then there's probably been other classes. First one that came to mind for me was math, where I needed that external motivation. I needed the deadlines. I needed the here's what you have to do by this date to get into it. It was not otherwise satisfying to accomplish it. So it really varies both for leadership and for fellowship, how you are going to view these, and even, again, onto the situation. So do you see how you could align with X and Y? So now we're going to go into one I'm hoping you also have heard about, but if not, we'll do a little more detail in class on this as well. So we're going to take a look at Theory Z. This was developed in the 70s and 80s. If you've studied Toyota, you probably came across this there. So in the 80s, there's this trend where American consumers were purchasing a lot of Japanese products, electronics, television, and Japanese cars were hot. So two reasons: high quality, low prices. And this led to research comparing Japanese and American companies, and thus Theory Z emerged by this scholar. Japan was known for high productivity and enthusiasm for work, and the scholarship on this said it was because of the management style, which they termed Z. So American companies tended to be generally, this was because Japanese companies tended to be more collectivistic, and you could see that approach in some of the assumptions. And I want to really emphasize that word assumptions there, because they were assumptions held about it, but we know this wasn't true for all companies. It's a complicated topic, and a lot of different things were going on. But generally, the Theory Z leadership philosophy held these three assumptions. First off, that people want happy, close relationships with their coworkers, and they desire affiliation. You can see this now when you think of tech companies, where they feel like the big perk is for everybody to get the matching North Face jackets with the company logo on there. Like that's a thing, and that affiliation can bring with it some esteem. Second is people want to be supported by the company. They want that work-life balance. They value a company that understands that, and that could be through vacation and leave policies, strong company culture, long-term development, consensus in decision-making, and third, that they can be trusted. You'll see that in policies as well. So if we hit on that vacation leave policy, they trust people to get their work done, so they then let the people, in theory, make choices about when they have time off. So given the right management support, workers can be trusted to do their jobs and then support others. The idea behind this is they want a stable work environment that produces high morale and productivity. Leaders have this power to increase job satisfaction that can lead to increased productivity. In fact, we'll look at an example of this in class, where a Z leader might not even need to show up because they just trust that people will get things done. So Theory Z cultures could include things like strong company philosophy and culture. If you've interviewed at Toyota or interned there, you know that they put a big emphasis on that culture being understood and for people being the right culture fit, even now that they're not so closely aligned with this theory here in Plano. Then next is the long-term development and employment. So job security is key here, clear understanding of how promotion works, what training opportunities exist. Collective responsibility, collective decision making, encouraging employees to participate in that decision making, because employees have a lot of responsibility, and involved in the decisions, they can rotate through jobs, get training in other areas, know the company better. It's going to be a company that values employee happiness and well-being and reflects that in programs to help. And while there's formal measures to assess performance, management tends to be hands-off because employees are empowered to work. This is the kind of company where you could have a CEO who's taking pictures of himself, herself out snowboarding on a work day, and employees would find that encouraging. I think for me, because again, my work style, my leadership style, my followership style, I'd see that and feel like that was communicating that they're not working and why. But again, that's why this is really an interesting idea. And then finally, with this assumptions and how this would look, is it would be individual responsibility and contributions are recognized, but it's in a collective whole team effort. Theory Z has a focus on long-term employment and giving people responsibility. It's not going to be the best fit for all companies. It can be difficult for employers and employees to make long-term commitments, and collective decision-making takes time. That can be a poor fit depending on the industry, on the situation. It could be that also the heart of this theory really is about organizational culture. So if an organization wants to operate under a Theory Z, it's a cultural shift. You can't come in as an individual manager and be like, hey, look at me, I'm out snowboarding. Doesn't that encourage you to work harder? And again, that doesn't work for me, but there are other companies where it would work for them. And there are some collectivist things you'll see. I mean, let's even talk about here at UT Dallas, where let's say they do the TMOC socks, and that can feel like here's this fun affiliation, but of course it's not as big as, say, you might see at another university in Texas down south of us, where color and logo is much more important, and that can be part of like that buy-in affiliation. All right, so a leadership style is the behavior of leaders, focusing on what leaders do and how they act. That's out of the book, but I want to really emphasize that definition. Leadership philosophies inform leadership styles. Your perceptions of followers, your role as a leader, are going to impact your behavior and style, like I've already said. The book touches on 3 styles most commonly associated with X and Y. So that's authoritarian, democratic, and laissez-faire. So we're going to focus, or since we're focusing on X and Y, we're going to go into depth a little bit more on the associated styles. You should have heard about these before. I think that often you'll talk about them even in high school government class, and then later, of course, in college classes, but I'm going to guess you haven't really thought about how this looks when you're thinking about a team manager. So people might not identify a leader and be like, ooh, they're so laissez-faire, but they like to analyze leadership styles, and it can help from this perspective. So I'm going to do some quick overview because your book does details about this and give you some examples. So an authoritarian leader thinks followers need direction. So that's X, right? Ding ding, that philosophy informs the style. These leaders believe followers would not function without direct supervision. So it's a leader determines tasks, procedures, tries exerting influence and control over the group members. And you'll see this control a lot of times by creating boundaries. So creating distance between themselves and followers to emphasize role distinction and try to direct communication to the leader rather than communication among coworkers. Ooh, a really good practical example of this is when there is an executive labeled parking spot. So we want to have things that are going to be a physical distinction between the leader and the follower. There's lots of places where there is no, like at UT Dallas, there's no special parking for the deans in JSOM. They have to pay for their parking passes, and there's not like a labeled spot. Other places, they have those labeled spots. So this leadership on its face doesn't sound great, but it has positives. This leadership style, it's efficient, it's productive. If you think about somebody, I don't know, maybe our UTD police officer out there directing traffic that first week of the semester, that person needs to be assertive, keep people focused on a task, to have the role of the leader. There is not time for chit chat. Like, nobody wants that on their drive into campus. Authoritarian leaders give direction and clarity to people's work and accomplish more in a shorter period, typically. For example, a manager communicating, giving instructions to new employees might adopt a really authoritarian style to keep the focus on the task. Make it clear what everyone's task is. It's a faster approach than being democratic and asking for input on typical policies and procedures that you're trying to communicate. Input might not be necessary. So same way, let's say I'm giving out an assignment, if I just gave it out and told you, here is our quick activity for today, versus if I gave you out an activity and said, let's have a discussion about this activity first before we go into doing it, you can just see how that would suck up class time, and it's much more efficient just to process through things sometimes. Here's the problem though. This can foster dependence when you're leading a team, submissiveness, and a loss of individuality. Employees can definitely become discontent and hostile if they don't understand why choices are being made, or if they feel like traditionally they've gotten opportunities to be individual and you're taking those away from them. And if that sounds really American, it is. All right, so just know cultural differences will be at play here. All right, second, let's talk about democratic leadership styles. Democratic leadership style echoes the assumptions of why. So democratic leaders are going to guide followers rather than directing them. Do not usually emphasize role hierarchy like authoritarian leaders. Instead, they're going to try to speak on the same level as their followers. Listening to followers is a priority. So they promote communication among group members and give suggestions without seeming to give orders or apply pressure. That last line's out of the book. With this type of leadership, you have greater group member satisfaction and commitment. So it tends to be a little friendlier, there tends to be more mutual praise, and more group-mindedness. It can result in stronger motivation and greater creativity, especially if everybody has bought in equally. So let's give an example of a store manager with a democratic style. They might take the time to, when they're communicating with their sales associates, to ask for recommendations on store displays. Or a professor with this style might ask students for suggestions or input on lecture topics or what they want to learn. That is something that I really love to get at the end of the semester. I usually go above and beyond trying to get people to give me feedback if they're open to it. I'm not offended by that. I love to be told what's working and what's not working. A lot of times when we look at a university culture that can get more commitment and buy-in. Same thing for the workplace when you're managing a team or when you're leading in an organization. The more you can make it clear that you are open to feedback, the more likely your followers are to tell you the truth about what is happening. If you shut down that communication channel and they don't tell you things, it is going to result in errors or missed opportunities for improvement. Third style, as we move on, is laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is allowed to do, let it be. If it's, you took high school French like I did a long time. I took French all the way through college too, but I'm terrible at it. Laissez-faire leadership style is dissimilar to both theory X and theory Y. This type of leader doesn't try to control or nurture their followers. Instead, this is almost a non-leadership style. This leader aims to have minimal influence and tends to be quite laid back. They don't try and influence their followers. They let it be. Now, in an ineffective version of this, the leader abdicates the responsibility of their role. So it's kind of that lazy person. They withdraw from followers. They don't offer guidance and support. This is going to lower productivity, cohesiveness, and satisfaction. It is going to tank communication, to use a cliche there. People won't want to talk to that person. This supervisor could be incompetent, could be just close to retirement, could be getting laid off, or could just be acting this way because that's what they're getting from their higher up leaders as well. If you're dealing with effective laissez-faire leadership, which happens, the idea is that the leader provides guided freedom. So they offer support, advice when asked, but provide a great deal of autonomy and only participate in decision making when asked or when it's deemed necessary. There's a time and a place for this. For example, a leader observing group deliberations, or a research manager allowing employees to work on product designs without his or her input. And I'll pause and say here, where this works is when things are going pretty well. If you are hired in to manage a team or lead in an organization and there are problems, this is not going to be, from my perspective and my experience, this is not going to be an option for you. This kind of laid back, letting it happen approach really only works in some specific situations that already have a positive dynamic, are hitting their marks for what they're supposed to be doing. So let's look at the role of communication now in leadership styles. So by looking at these behaviors, oh gosh, I love this chart, but you can see how these three styles differ. We see a democratic leader is involved, works with their followers, so there's going to be dialogue, There's going to be goal setting. There's going to be two-way communication, a lot of interaction, and that leader will provide positive, frequent feedback. Authoritarian leaders are going to command that room. They're going to set goals for people. I think that goal setting is a really good way to understand this. They're probably not going to be really that interested in listening. They're going to personally direct the completion of tasks, and they're going to use conflict for personal gain. So people aren't getting along, well, let's figure out how to get rid of the person who's not getting along to keep the one who benefits me. And then laissez-faire. Again, let's look at the goal setting. So allows the followers to set their own goals. So gosh, just looking at that top right there, I feel like that's just such a clear way to understand the three differences here. Laissez-faire is non-committal, superficial communication, doesn't want to give an answer, might be avoiding interaction with their followers, and they're not going to provide any feedback or really infrequent feedback. They'll avoid offering rewards or punishment, and they're going to avoid conflict, often to the detriment of their team. All right. So this, I think, is really useful when you're thinking about what these look like, and this is not in our book, so definitely take some notes or screenshot that. All right, before we get into followership, I wanted to finish off the leadership styles with looking a little more at recent research on leadership styles. So this is a compilation. It helps you see where there's positive and negatives to each style. Again, you might want to screenshot this and drop it into your study guide notes. While research on the democratic style is overwhelmingly positive, remember it takes time to implement, not always feasible. So here we see authoritarian leadership can be helpful with large groups and simple tasks, but it can increase aggression from followers and increase employee turnover. My experience there, and one thing that is not on that list, is again, if you're going in and been given leadership or management of a team where there's dysfunction or there's issues, there's things you have to fix, and it's going to be expected that you fix them. You're going to have to do some authoritarian leadership until you're to a point where you can shift to the democratic. Don't think of authoritarian as necessarily bad. Research on democratic is overwhelmingly positive, but it's going to take time to implement. It's not going to be always feasible. Authoritarian, again, can be helpful in some situations. Laissez-faire usually isn't implemented properly, so if employees feel like a leader with this style is absent, has abdicated their position, they're going to be unmotivated, dissatisfied, and isolated. When done right, it can be great for really self-motivated experts, but otherwise it can become a real issue. So we're almost done here, but I'm going to take a couple of minutes first to talk about this concept of followership. When we define leadership, we talked about it as a process with leaders and followers involved. And so what we've learned so far in this class, we know that effective leadership isn't just about the leader. It depends on the situation and the people involved. Given this, it is really interesting that leadership texts often don't focus much on followers. And you know from our definition about communication, you can't just lead out into a void. You can't communicate out into a void and think that you've actually communicated. You're just talking into the void. Same thing with leadership. Leaders and followers work together to meet shared objectives, so we shouldn't overemphasize leaders at the expense of not studying followers. And one other sort of comment I'll make right there too is you might be a leader, but you're probably also going to be following someone unless you are leaving college and hired as the CEO. So the real leaders are few, other than different for small businesses, but those of you that go into corporate settings, you're going to be a follower and a leader. So you will need the hard work and have commitment of followers. So at some point you're going to be this follower. You're going to switch from follower to leader and back and forth, and often in one day. At least that's my experience too. Leaders have more influence in the responsibility for the direction of the group, and followers are going to be more involved in the implementation plans and carrying out the work. People shift in these roles. You can even think about student in the classroom. You might follow a professor, but then be leading your small group. You might be a leader in one campus organization and a member in another. Recognize that you can learn to lead by following and learn to follow by leading, and by understanding your perception of that, and hopefully your book self-assessments are helping you with this, you can get better at all of it. Followers, like leaders, need to understand their communication styles and orientations to be successful. There's multiple systems and typologies that look at followership. Some focus on level of engagement, some productivity, job satisfaction. I'm going to take you into, for a second, Robert Kelly's research on exemplary followership. So you can see that on the left side of the slide right there. Kelly identified components that make up follower styles by asking people in interviews and focus groups to describe best, worst, typical followers. He found followers differ on 2 dimensions: independent critical thinking and active engagement. The best followers, they think independently and they take initiative. The worst ones, they have to be told what to do, require constant supervision. Now, typical followers, though, they're going to take direction and complete jobs themselves after being told the expectations. Let's look at the 5 followership styles that emerge from these 2 dimensions. At the top left of our image, we have alienated followers. So they're independent thinkers, but they just don't participate in helping the organization. They put most of their energy into fighting the organization and not getting things done. An alienating follower might be disillusioned with leaders, feeling unappreciated. They're cynical, not helpful. Sometimes it's good to have because they can offer skepticism. So if you can harness this, it can be really useful. An example of an alienated follower might be somebody who's the group critic, sits in the back of the conference room, mutters about what's happening. They've gotten passed over for promotion and now they really dislike you because you took their job. It is that person. So if you look at the bottom right of the grid, you're going to see conformist followers. These are committed to the organization and they're active, don't think independently. They're busy, they work hard, but they're not going to think about what they're doing. They're just getting it done. So they are this cliche of that yes men, yes woman, if you've heard that phrase. The kind of people who hold back ideas. They're conformist. They avoid conflict. They don't question orders. They're very loyal to the boss. This is a wonderful person if you're leading, to have somebody who's going to work hard for you. But at the same time, if they're working hard and then something goes wrong, you want them to tell you, and they might not do that. In the middle are pragmatists. So these are survivors. So someone with this style is moderately independent engaged. They shift their follower style to suit the situations. You can see how their square touches all the grid. This shifting of style is how they cope with organizational uncertainty. So if there's changes in leaderships, there's potential layoffs, there's restructuring. Somebody with this style is going to hold on to their job, probably not going to get promoted because they're following. The bottom left is passive. So this person doesn't think independently. They're not going to take action. They are what some people will call, again with cliches here, the sheep. So using this style, they rely heavily on the leader's direction. They meet the bare minimum of expectations. They're going to do their work, but stop. There's no initiative. This can stem from having a lack of skills, lack of motivation. Here's my empathy kicking in. I can also see this passive, or even a conformist, but especially a passive follower just having maybe a lot going on in life. They can't go beyond at work. They are at their max. It's not necessarily their fault. It could be they're just also under an authoritarian leader in a blame-oriented, micromanaging corporate culture. They learn to be a sheep. And I will say one other thing, that when you are managing people, especially new hires, you might have somebody like this where you hire them and they're passive, but through work, you can move them up to that last category that I'm about to touch on, which is exemplary. This is something that can be trained. So best for last here. This is our star followers, our exemplary followers. It's a person who's independent and active. They're going to contribute ideas, go above expectations. Again, these are followership styles. They don't define the person. They're a role a person adopts. Definitely, I have worked with people who are exemplary followers. Those are the people when you're doing promotions, you're probably going to think of first. They're the kind of person who might see a problem, but they're not going to sit there and grumble about the problem. They're going to say, ooh, how can I think about solutions and bring solutions to my leader? And even if you're a leader and you're following other people, that's the box you want to be in. Thinking independently, thinking actively, and contributing in a positive way towards corporate culture. So these are roles adopted. Again, they're roles adopted, roles that might shift. You can attempt and exhibit an exemplary style in a job you're passionate about, but if you're under a miserable leader, you're probably going to take on a different style. And even if you don't take on a different style at first, you're probably going to get broken down into that eventually if you have a really bad boss. So it makes sense. If we think of leadership as a process, it works when leaders and followers are engaged in employing critical thinking. Specifically, research shows that effective followers demonstrate 3 skills or values. 1, they're going to add value to the organization by helping it reach its objectives. They understand what needs to be done, develop skills to carry it out, do the tasks. They weave a web of relationships throughout the organization. They connect with others. And finally, they operate from an ethical viewpoint and are willing to speak up or disobey leaders if unethical practices occur. And we're going to come back to that in a later class. All right, so as we conclude, here is the thing I would like you to think about as we go forward. Follower styles don't happen in a vacuum. Leadership and the situation are going to influence them. So what I would like you to do going forward is think about how leaders communicate, how communication styles affect your performance as a follower, and what both leaders can do to promote followership, but what you can do to promote followership and your leadership situations that you're already in, even if that's just a team project in a class right now. All right, we just covered a ton of content. So take some time to answer the study guide questions if you didn't note that as we went through. But more importantly here, think about how this applies to your life. The more you can increase and improve your ability to be a leader and improve and understand your ability to be a follower, you're going to have a happier time at work. I know there's some OBHR profs who say it's the process of making yourself not miserable, but I would want to go further than that. This is the opportunity that you have to create positive change and create a positive climate in the workplace. All of us have a philosophy of leadership based in beliefs about human nature and work, and that philosophy is going to influence our leadership style. Understanding our philosophy, our styles of leadership, and our styles of followership can make us informed and effective leaders.